Chapter 12. The sun had barely taken the chill off the morning air when we set out with baskets stocked with plantains, calabashes, hammocks, the paraphernalia for decorating ourselves, and the items for trade, thick bundles of undyed cotton yarn, newly fashioned arrowheads, bamboo containers filled with epina and onoto. With their own hammocks slung around their necks, the older children walked close behind their mothers. The men, closing up the rear of each family unit, carried nothing but their bows and arrows. There were 23 of us. For 4 days, we walked silently through the forest at a relaxed pace, set by the old people and children. Whenever they became aware of the slightest movement or sound in the thicket, the women stood still, pointing with their chins in the direction of the disturbance. Swiftly the men disappeared in the specified direction. More often than not, they returned with an agouti, a rabbit-like rodent, or a peccary, or a bird, which was cooked as soon as we made camp in the afternoon. The children were forever on the lookout for wild fruit. Their keen eyes would follow the flight of bees until they reached their hives in a hollow tree trunk. While the insects were still in flight, they were able to accurately identify whether they belonged to the stinging or non-stinging variety. Hayama, Kamosiwe, and several of the old people wrapped strips of the fibrous bast of a tree around their thorax and abdomen. They claimed it restored their energy and made walking easier. I tried it too, but the tightly wrapped bast alone only gave me a rash. As we climbed up and down hills, I wondered if it was a different route from the one I had been on with Milagros. There was not a tree, rock, or stretch of river I could recall. Neither did I remember having encountered mosquitoes and other insects hovering above the marshes. Attracted by our sweaty bodies, they buzzed around us with a maddening persistence. I, who had never been bothered by them, could not decide which part of my body to scratch first. My torn t-shirt offered no protection. Even Iramamowe, who initially had been oblivious to their unrelenting bites, occasionally acknowledged the inconvenience by slapping his neck, his arms, or by lifting his leg to scratch his ankle. Around noon of the 5th day, we made camp at the edge of the Mokototeri's gardens. The cleared-out undergrowth made the giant cebas appear even more monumental than in the forest. Shafts of sunlight filtered through the leaves, illuminating and shadowing the dark ground. We bathed in the nearby river, where red flowers suspended from lianas overhanging the water swayed with sensuous grace to the rhythm of the breeze. Iramamowe and 3 other young men were the first to don their festive attire and to paint themselves with onoto before heading toward the host's Shabono. Iramamowe returned shortly, carrying a basket filled with roasted meat and baked plantains. "Ohoo! The Mokototeri have so much more," he said, distributing the food among us. Before the women began to beautify themselves, they assisted their men with the pasting of white down on their hair and tying feathers and monkey fur around their arms and heads. I was given the task of decorating the children's faces and bodies with the prescribed onoto designs. Our laughter and chatter were interrupted by the shouts of an approaching Mokototeri. "He looks like a monkey," Ritime whispered. I nodded in agreement, barely able to conceal my giggles. The man's short bowed legs and long, disproportionate arms seemed even more pronounced as he stood next to Itiwe and Iramamoe, who looked imposing with their white down-covered heads, the long multicolored macaw feathers streaming from their armbands, and their bright red waist belts. Our headman wants to start the feast. He wants you to come soon, the Mokototeri said, in the same formal high-pitched voice as the man who had come to the Shabono to invite us to the feast. If you take too long to prepare yourselves, there will be no time to talk. With their heads held high, their chins slightly pushed up, Itiwe, Iramamoe, and 3 young men, also properly painted and decorated, followed the Mokototeri. Although they pretended indifference, the men were aware of the admiring glances of the rest of us as they strutted toward the Shabono. Overcome by last-minute nervousness, the women hurried through the last touches of their toilet, adding a flower or feather here, a dab of onoto there. How they looked was entirely up to the judgment of the others, for there were no mirrors. Ritime fastened the waist belt around me, making sure the wide fringe was centered properly. "You're still so thin," she said, touching my breasts, "even though you eat so much. Don't eat today the way you eat at our Shabono, or the Mokototeri will think we don't give you enough." I promised to eat very sparingly, then burst into laughter, as I remembered that this was the same advice my mother used to give me as a child, whenever I was invited to spend the weekend with friends. She too had been embarrassed by my voracious appetite, thinking that people might believe I was not properly fed at home, or worse yet, that they might think I had a tapeworm. Just before we set out toward the Mokototeri Shabono, old Hayama admonished her great-grandchildren, Teshoma and Sisiwe, to behave properly, raising her voice so that the other children who had come with us could also hear her. She stressed how important it was to minimize any chance for the Mokototeri women to criticize them once they had departed. Old Hayama insisted the children try to urinate and defecate for one last time behind the bushes. For once inside the Shabono, no one would clean up after them or take them outside if they had to go. Upon reaching the Mokototeri clearing, the men formed a line, holding their weapons vertically to their upraised, haughty faces. We stood behind them with the children. A group of shouting women ran out of the huts as soon as they saw me. I was neither afraid nor repelled as they touched, kissed, and licked my face and body. But Ritimi seemed to have forgotten how the Itikoteri had first greeted me when I arrived at their settlement, for she kept mumbling under her breath that she would have to retrace the onoto designs on my skin. Holding my arm in a strong grip, one of the Mokototeri women pushed Ritimi aside. "Come with me, white girl," she said. "No!" Ritimi shouted, pulling me closer to her. Her smile did not detract from the sharp, angry tone of her voice. "I brought the white girl for you to look at. No one must take her away from me. We are like each other's shadows. I go where she goes. She goes where I go." Trying to outstare her opponent, Ritimi's eyes held the woman's fixed gaze, daring her to challenge her words. The woman opened her tobacco-filled mouth in gaping laughter. "If you have brought the white girl to visit, you must let her come into my hut." Someone from behind the group of women approached us. With arms crossed over his chest, he pushed his hips forward with a little swagger as he came to stand beside me. "I'm the head man of the Mokototeri," he said. As he smiled, his eyes were but two shining slits amidst the red designs of his deeply wrinkled face. "Is the white girl your sister that you protect her so?" he asked Ritimi. "Yes," she said forcefully. "She is my sister." Shaking his head in disbelief, the headman studied me. He seemed totally unimpressed. "I can see that she is white, but she doesn't look like a real white woman," he finally said. "Her feet are bare like ours. She does not wear strange clothes on her body, except for this." He pulled at my torn, loose underpants. "Why does she wear this under an Indian waist belt?" "Panties," Ritimi said importantly. She liked the English word better than the Spanish, which she had also learned. "That's what white people call it." "She has two more of them. She wears panties because she is afraid that spiders at night and centipedes during the day might crawl inside her body." Nodding as if he understood my fear, the head man touched my short hair and rubbed his fleshy palm over my shaven tonsure. "It's the color of the young acai palm fronds." He moved his face close to mine until our noses touched. "What strange eyes. They are the color of rain." His scowl disappeared in a smile of delight. "Yes, she must be white. And if you call her sister, then no one will take her away from you," he said to Ritimi. "How can you call her sister?" the woman who still held my arm asked. There was earnest perplexity written all over her painted face as she gazed at me. "I call her sister because she is like us," Ritimi said, putting her arm around my waist. "I want her to come and stay in my hut," the woman said. "I want her to touch my children." We followed the woman into one of the huts. Bows and arrows were leaning against the sloping roof. Bananas, gourds, and bundles of meat wrapped in leaves were strung from the rafters. Machetes, axes, and an assortment of clubs lay in the corners. The ground was littered with twigs, branches, fruit skins, and shards of earthenware vessels. Ritimi sat with me in the same cotton hammock. As soon as I had finished the juice made from soaked palm fruit the woman had given me, she placed the small baby in my lap. "Caress him." Turning and twisting in my arms, the infant almost fell to the ground. And when he stared into my face, he began to bawl. "You better take him," I said, handing the woman the child. "Babies are afraid of me. They first have to get to know me before I can touch them." "Is that so?" the woman asked, eyeing Ritimi suspiciously as she rocked the baby in her arms. "Our babies don't scream." Ritimi cast contemptuous glances at the infant. "My own and my father's children even sleep with her in the same hammock." "I'll call the older children," the woman said, gesturing toward the little girls and boys pecking from behind the bundles of plantains stacked against the sloping roof. "Don't," I said. I knew that they would be frightened too. "If you force them to come, they too will cry." "Yes," said one of the women who had followed us into the hut. "The children will sit with the white girl as soon as they see that their mothers are not afraid to touch her palm fiber hair and pale body." Several women had gathered around us. Tentatively at first, their hands explored my face Then my neck, arms, breasts, stomach, thighs, knees, calves, toes. There was not a part of me they left unexamined. Whenever they discovered a mosquito bite or a scratch, they spat on it, then rubbed the spot with their thumbs. If the bite was recent, they sucked out the poison. Although I had become accustomed to Ritimi's, Tutami's, and the Itikoteri children's lavish shows of affection, which never lasted more than a moment, I felt uncomfortable under the exploring touch of so many hands on my body. "What are they doing?" I asked, pointing to a group of men squatting outside the hut next to us. "They are preparing the acai leaves for the dance," said the woman who had placed the baby in my lap. "Do you want to look at that?" "Yes," I said emphatically, wanting to shift the attention away from myself. "Does Ritimi have to accompany you everywhere you go?" the woman asked as Ritimi got up from the hammock with me. "Yes," I said. "Had it not been for her, I would not be visiting your Shabono." Ritimi had taken care of me since I arrived in the forest. Ritimi beamed at me. I wish I had expressed words to that effect sooner. Not once during the rest of our stay did any of the Mokototeri women question Ritimi's proprietary manner toward me. The men outside the hut were separating the still closed, pale yellow leaves of the young acai palm with sharp little sticks. One of the men rose from his squatting position as we approached. Taking the tobacco wad from his mouth, he wiped the dribbling juice from his chin with the back of his hand and held the palm frond over my head. Smiling, he pointed to the fine gold veins in the leaf, barely visible against the light of the setting sun. He touched my hair, replaced the wad in his mouth, and without saying a word, continued separating the leaves. Fires were lit in the middle of the clearing as soon as it was dark. The Itikoteri men touched off an explosion of wild cheering from their hosts as they lined up, weapons in hand, around the fires. Two at a time, the Itikoteri danced around the clearing, slowing down in front of each hut so all could admire their attire and their dancing steps. Itiwa and Iramamowe made up the last pair. Shouts reached a higher pitch as they moved in perfectly matched steps. They did not dance around the huts, but stayed close to the fires, wheeling and spinning at an ever-accelerating speed, their rhythm dictated by the leaping flames. Itiwa and Iramamowe stopped abruptly in their tracks, held their bows and arrows vertically next to their faces, then aimed them at the Mokototeri men standing in front of their huts. Laughing uproariously, the two men resumed their dance, while the onlookers broke out in exultant, approving shouts. The Itikoteri men were invited by their hosts to rest in their hammocks. While food was served, a group of Mokototeri burst into the clearing. "Hai, hai, hai," they shouted, moving to the clacking of their bows and arrows, to the swishing sound of the fringed, undulating acai palm fronds. I could hardly make out the dancing figures. At times, they seemed fused together. Then they leapt apart. Fragments of dancing arms, legs, and feet visible from between the swaying palm fronds. Black, bird-like silhouettes with giant wings as they moved away from the light of the fires. Blazing copper figures, no longer man or bird, as their bodies glistening with sweat glowed in the flames. "We want to dance with your women," the Mokototeri demanded. When there was no response from the Itikoteri, they jeered. "You are jealous of them. Why don't you let your poor women dance? Don't you remember we let you dance with our women at your feast?" "Whoever wants to dance with the Mokototeri may do so," Ira Mamoe shouted, then admonished the men. "But you will not force any of our women to dance if they don't wish to do so." "Hai, hai, hai!" the men yelled euphorically, welcoming the Itikoteri women as well as their own. "Don't you want to dance?" I asked Ritimi. "I will go with you." "No, I don't want to lose you in the crowd," she said. "I don't want anyone to hit you on the head." "But that was an accident. Besides, the Mokototeri are not dancing with fire logs," I said. "What could they possibly do with palm fronds?" Ritimi shrugged her shoulders. "My father said the Mokototeri are not to be trusted." "I thought one only invites one's friends to a feast." "Enemies, too," Ritimi said, giggling. "Feasts are a good time to find out what people are planning to do." "The Mokototeri are very friendly," I said. "They have fed us very well." "They feed us well because they don't want anyone to say they are stingy," Ritimi said. "But as my father has told you, you are still ignorant. You obviously don't know what's going on if you think they are friendly." Ritimi patted my head as if I were a child. Then continued. "Didn't you notice that our men didn't take Epina this afternoon? Haven't you realized how watchful they are?" I had not noticed and was tempted to add that I thought the Itikoteri behavior was not very friendly but remained quiet. After all, as Ritimi had pointed out, I did not understand what was going on. I observed the 6 Itikoteri men dancing around the fires. They were not moving with their usual abandon, and their eyes kept darting back and forth, keenly watching all that went on around them. The rest of the Itikoteri men were not lounging in their hosts' hammocks, but were standing outside the huts. The dance had lost its enchantment for me. Shadows and voices took on a different mood. The night now seemed packed with an ominous darkness. I began to eat what had been served to me earlier. "This meat tastes bitter," I said, wondering if it was poisoned. "It's bitter because of the mamukori," Ritimi said casually. "The spot where the poisoned arrow hit the monkey hasn't been washed properly." I spat out the meat. Not only was I afraid of being poisoned, but I felt nauseous as I remembered the sight of the monkey boiling in the tall aluminum pot, a layer of fat and monkey hairs floating on the surface. Ritimi put the piece of meat back on my calabash plate. "Eat it," she urged me. "It's good, even the bitter part. Your body will get used to the poison. Don't you know that fathers always give their sons the part where the arrow hit? If they are shot in a raid by a poisoned arrow, they won't die because their bodies will be used to the mamukori. I'm afraid that before I get hit by a poisoned arrow, I will die from eating poisoned meat." "No, one doesn't die from eating mamukori," Ritimi assured me. "It has to go through the skin." She took the already chewed piece from my calabash, bit off a chunk, then pushed the remaining half into my gaping mouth. Smiling mockingly, she exchanged her dish with mine. "I don't want you to choke," she said, eating the rest of the cooked monkey breast with exaggerated gusto. Still chewing, she pointed toward the clearing and asked if I could see the women with the round face dancing by the fire. I nodded, but I did not recognize which one she meant. There were about 10 women dancing close to the fire. They all had round faces, dark slanted eyes, voluptuous bodies, the color of honey in the light of the flames. She is the one who had intercourse with Itiwa at our feast, Ritimi said. I've bewitched her already. When did you do that? This afternoon, Ritimi said softly and began to giggle. I blew the okoshiki I had collected from my garden on her hammock, she added with satisfaction. What if someone else sits in her hammock? It makes no difference. The magic is only meant to harm her, Ritimi assured me. I had no chance to find out more about the bewitching, for at that moment, the dancing ceased, and the tired, smiling dancers returned to the various huts to rest and to eat. The woman who joined us around the hearth were surprised Ritimi and I had not danced. Dancing was as important as painting the body with an oto. It kept one young and happy. Shortly, the headman stepped into the clearing and announced in a thunderous voice, I want to hear the Itikoteri women sing. Their voices are pleasing to my ears. I want our women to learn their songs. Giggling, the women nudged each other. You go, Ritimi, one of Iramamoe's wives said. Your voice is beautiful. That was all the encouragement Ritimi needed. Let's all go together, she said, standing up. Silence spread over the Shabono as we walked out into the clearing with our arms around each other's waists. Facing the headman's hut, Ritimi began to sing in a clear, melodious voice. The songs were very short. The last 2 lines were repeated as a chorus by the rest of us. The other women sang too, but it was Ritimi's song, one in particular that the Mokototeri headman insisted she repeat until his woman had learned it. When the wind blows the palm leaves, I listen to their melancholy sound with the silent frogs. High in the sky, the stars are all laughing, but cry tears of sadness as the clouds cover them. The headman walked toward us, and addressing me, said, Now you must sing for us. But I don't know any songs, I said, unable to repress my giggles. You must know some, the headman insisted. I've heard stories of how much the whites like to sing. They even have boxes that sing. In the 3rd grade in Caracas, I had been told by the music teacher that besides having a dreadful voice, I was also tone deaf. However, Professor Hans, as he expected to be addressed, was not insensitive to my desire to sing. He allowed me to remain in the class, provided I stay in the last row, and sang very softly. Professor Hans did not bother much with the required religious and folk songs we were supposed to be learning, but taught us Argentinian tangos from the 30s. I had not forgotten those songs. Looking at the expectant faces around me, I stepped closer to the fire. I cleared my throat and began to sing, oblivious to the jarring notes escaping my throat. For a moment, I felt I was faithfully reproducing the passionate manner in which Professor Hans had sung his tangos. I clutched my hands to my breast. I closed my eyes as if transported with the sadness and tragedy of each line. My audience was spellbound. The Mokototeri and Itikoteri had come out of their huts to watch my every gesture. The headman stared at me for a long time, then finally said, "Our women cannot learn to sing in this strange manner." The men sang next. Each singer stood alone in the middle of the clearing, both hands resting high on his upright bow. Sometimes a friend accompanied the performer. Then the singer rested his arm over his companion's shoulder. One song in particular, sung by a Mokototeri youth, was the favorite of the night. When a monkey jumps from tree to tree, I shoot it with my arrow. Only green leaves drop down. Swirling around, they gather at my feet. The Itikoteri men did not lie down in their hammocks, but talked and sang with their hosts throughout the night. I slept with the women and children in the empty huts around the main entrance of the Shabono. In the morning, I stuffed myself with the papayas and pineapples one of the Mokototeri girls had brought for me from her father's garden. Ritimi and I had discovered them earlier on our way into the bush. She had advised me not to ask for the fruit, not because it was not proper, but because the fruit was unripe. But I did not mind their sour taste, or even the slight stomachache that followed. I had not eaten familiar fruits for months. Bananas and palm fruit were like vegetables to me. "You had a wretched voice when you sang," a young man said, squatting next to me. "Ooh-hoo! I didn't understand your song, but it sounded hideous." Speechless, I glared at him. I did not know whether to laugh or insult him in turn. Putting her arms around my neck, Ritimi burst into laughter. She looked at me askance, then whispered in my ear, "When you sang, I thought the monkey meat had given you a bellyache." Squatting on the same spot in the clearing where they had started out last night, a group of Itikoteri and Mokototeri men were still talking in the formal, ritualized manner proper to the Wayamu. Bartering was a slow, involved affair during which equal importance was given to the items for trading and the exchange of information and gossip. Close to noon, some Mokototeri women began criticizing their husbands for the items they had exchanged, stating that they needed the machetes, aluminum pots, and cotton hammocks themselves. "Poisoned arrowheads?" one of the women shouted angrily. "You could make them yourself if you weren't so lazy." Without paying the slightest attention to the women's remarks, the men continued their hagglings. Chapter 13. It was past noon when we left the Mokototeri settlement, our baskets filled with the accustomed plantains, palm fruits, and meat given to departing guests. Shortly before nightfall, 3 Mokototeri men caught up with us. One of them raised his bow as he spoke. "Our head man wants the white girl to stay with us." He stared at me down the shaft of his drawn arrow. "Only a coward points his arrow at a woman," Iramamoe said, stepping in front of me. "Why don't you shoot, you useless Mokototeri?" "We haven't come to fight," the man remarked, returning his bow and arrow to an upright position. "We could have ambushed you some time ago. All we want is to frighten the white girl, so she'll come with us." "She cannot stay with you," Ira Mamoe said. "Milagros brought her to our Shabono. If he had wanted her to stay with you, he would have taken her to your settlement." "We want her to come with us," the man persisted. "We will bring her back before the rain starts." "If you make me angry, I shall kill you on the spot." Ira Mamoe pounded his chest. "Remember, you cowardly Mokototeri, that I'm a fierce warrior. The hikuras in my chest are always at my command, even without a pina." Ira Mamoe moved nearer to the three men. "Don't you know that the white girl belongs to the Itikoteri? Why don't you ask her where she wants to stay?" the man said. "She liked our people. Maybe she wants to live with us." Ira Mamoe began to laugh, a rumbling laughter that did not reveal whether he was amused or outraged. He stopped abruptly. "The white girl does not like the way the Mokototeri look. She said you all resemble monkeys." Ira Mamoe turned toward me. There was such a pleading expression in his eyes that it was all I could do not to giggle. I felt a tinge of remorse as I looked into the bewildered faces of the three Mokototeri. For an instant, I felt tempted to deny Ira Mamoe's words, but I could not ignore his anger. Nor had I forgotten Arasue's apprehension at my going to the feast. I crossed my arms over my chest, lifted my chin, and without looking at them directly, said, "I don't want to go to your settlement. I don't want to eat and sleep with monkeys." The Itikoteri burst into loud guffaws. The three men turned around abruptly, then disappeared on the path leading into the thicket. We made camp not too far from the river, in a cleared area of the forest, where the remains of temporary shelters still stood. We did not cover them with new leaves, for old Kamosiwe assured us that it would not rain that night. Ira Mamoe did not eat, but sat, glum and intense, in front of the fire. There was a tension about him, as if he were expecting the three men to reappear at any moment. "Is there any danger the Mokototeri might come back?" I asked. Ira Mamoe was some time before giving me an answer. "They are cowards. They know that my arrows will kill them on the spot." He stared fixedly on the ground, his lips set in a straight line. "I'm considering what would be the best way to return to our Shabono. We should divide up our party," old Kamasue suggested, gazing at me with his one eye. "There is no moon tonight. The Mokototeri will not return. Perhaps tomorrow they will ask again for the white girl. We can tell them that they frightened her away, that she asked to be taken back to the mission." "Are you sending her back?" Ritimi's voice hung in the darkness, charged with anxiety. "No," the old man said cheerfully. The grayish bristles on his chin, his one eye that never missed anything, his slight wrinkled body gave him the appearance of a wicked elf. "Ituwa should return to the Shabono with Ritimi and the white girl by way of the mountains. It's a longer route, but they won't be slowed down by children and old people. They will reach our settlement no later than a day or two after we do." It is a good route, not traveled much. Old Kamosiwe got up and sniffed the air. It will rain tomorrow. Build a shelter for the night, he said to Itua, then squatted, a smile on his lips, his one sunken eye staring at me. Are you afraid to return to the Shabono by way of the mountains? Smiling, I shook my head. Somehow I could not envision myself to be in real danger. Were you afraid when the Mokototeri aimed his arrow at you? Old Kamosiwe asked. No, I knew the Itikoteri would protect me. I had to refrain myself from adding that the incident had seemed comical to me, rather than dangerous. I did not realize at the time that in spite of the oblivious bluffing, characteristic of any critical circumstance, the Mokototeri and Itikoteri were perfectly serious in their threats and demands. Old Kamosiwe was delighted with my reply. I had the feeling his pleasure derived not so much from the fact that I had not been frightened, but rather my trust in his people. He talked to Itua long into the night. Ritimi fell asleep, holding my hand in hers, a blissful smile on her lips. Watching her dream, I knew why she looked so happy. For a few days, she would have Itua practically to herself. In the Shabono, men hardly ever showed any outward affection toward their wives. It was considered a weakness. Only toward the children were the men openly tender and loving. They indulged, kissed, and caressed them lavishly. I had seen Itua, even the fierce Iramamoe, carry the heavy loads of wood for their women, only to drop them as soon as they approached the Shabono. When there had been no other man near, I had seen Itua save a special piece of meat or fruit for Ritimi or Tutemi. Protected by the darkness, I had seen him press his ear against Tutemi's womb to listen to the strong kicks of his unborn child. In the presence of others, he never mentioned that he was to be a father. Ritimi and I were awakened by Itua hours before dawn. Quietly we left the camp, following the sandy bank of the river. Except for our hammocks, a few plantains, and the 3 pineapples the Mokototeri girl had given me, our baskets were empty. Old Kamosiwe had assured Itua that he would find plenty of game. There was no moon, yet the water shone black, reflecting the faint glow of the sky. At intervals, the sound of a nocturnal bird darted through the stillness, a faint cry heralding the oncoming dawn. One by one, the stars faded. The contours of trees became distinct as the rosy light of dawn descended all the way to the shadows at our feet. I was astonished at the width of the river, at the silence of its flowing waters. So still, they did not seem to move. 3 macaws formed a triangle in the sky, painting the stationary clouds with their red, blue, and yellow feathers as the orange glowing sun rose over the treetops. Itua opened his mouth in a yawn that seemed to force its way up from the farthest depths of his lungs. He squinted. The light of the sun was too bright for eyes that had not slept enough. We unfastened our baskets. Ritimi and I sat on a log from where we watched Itua draw his bow. Slowly, he raised his arms and arched his back, pointing his arrow high in the air. Motionless he stood for an interminable time, a stone figure, each taut muscle carefully etched, his gaze attentive to the birds crossing the sky. I did not dare ask why he was waiting so long to let his arrow go. I did not hear the arrow travel through the air, only a flashing cry that dissolved into a flapping of wings. For an instant, the macaw, a mass of feathers held together by the red-tinted arrow, was suspended in the sky before it plunged downward, not too far from where Itua stood. Itua made a fire over which we roasted the plucked bird and some plantains. He ate only a small portion, insisting that we finish the rest so we would have enough strength for the arduous climb over the hills. We did not miss the sunlight on the river path as we turned into the thicket. The penumbra of vines and trees was soothing to our tired eyes. Decaying leaves looked like patches of flowers against the background of greenness. Itua cut branches from the dark wild cocoa trees. With this wood one makes the best fire drills, he said, stripping the branches of their bark with his sharp knife, which was made from the lower incisor of an agouti. Then he cut the green, yellow, and purple pods individually attached to the stunted cacao trunks by short leafless stems. He split the fruits open, and we sucked the sweet, gelatinous flesh surrounding the seeds, which we wrapped in leaves. Cooked, Ritimi explained. The pohoro seeds are delicious. I wondered if they would taste like chocolate. There must be monkeys and weasels nearby, Itua explained, showing me the discarded, chewed-up fruit skins on the ground. They like the pohoro fruit as much as we do. A bit further on, Itua stopped in front of a twisted vine, which he marked with his knife. Mamukori, he said. I will return to this spot when I need to make fresh poison. Ashukamaki, I exclaimed, as we stopped beneath a tree, its trunk encrusted with glossy wax-like leaves. But it was not the liana used to thicken curare. Itua pointed out that those leaves were long and jagged. He had stopped because of the various animal bones on the ground. Harpy eagle, he said, gesturing to the nest at the top of the tree. Don't kill the bird, Ritimi pleaded. Perhaps it's the spirit of a dead Itikoteri. Ignoring his wife, Itua climbed up the tree. Upon reaching the nest, he lifted out a shrieking, white, fluffy chick. We heard the loud cries of its mother as Itua threw the chick on the ground. He propped himself against the trunk and a branch that aimed his arrow at the circling bird. I'm glad I shot the bird, Itua said, motioning us to follow him to the spot where the dead eagle crashed through the trees. It eats only meat. He turned toward Ritimi, then added softly, I listened to its cry before I aimed my arrow. It wasn't the voice of a spirit. He plucked the soft white feathers from the bird's breast the long gray ones from its wings, then wrapped them in leaves. The afternoon heat, filtering through the leaves, made me so drowsy that all I wanted to do was sleep. Ritimi had dark smudges under her eyes, as if she had dabbed coal on the tender skin. Itua's pace slackened. Without saying a word, he headed toward the river. We stood motionless in the wide, shallow waters, held in suspension by the heat and the glare. We stared at the reflected clouds and trees, then lay down on a bank of ochre-colored sand in the middle of the river. Blues faded into green and red from the tannin of the submerged roots. Not a leaf stirred, not a cloud moved. Even the dragonflies hovering over the water seemed motionless in their transparent vibrations. Turning on my stomach, I let my hands lie flat on the river's surface, as if I could hold the languid harmony reigning between the reflection in the river and the glow in the sky. I slid on my stomach until my lips touched the water, then drank the mirrored clouds. 2 herons that had taken flight at our arrival returned. Poised on their long legs, with necks sunk between their feathers, they watched us through blinking, half-closed lids. I saw silvery bodies jump up in the air, seeking the intoxicating heat shimmering over the water. "Fish!" I exclaimed, my lethargy momentarily gone. Chuckling, Itua pointed with his arrow to a flock of shrieking parrots crossing the sky. "Birds!" he shouted, then reached for the bamboo quiver on his back. He took out an arrowhead, tasted it with the tip of his tongue to see if the poison was still good. Satisfied by its bitter taste, he fastened the sharp point to one of his arrow shafts. Next, he tested his bow by letting go of the string. "It's not well stretched," he said, untying it at one end. He twisted the string several times, then threaded it again. "We will stay here for the night," he said, wading through the water. He climbed up on the opposite bank, disappearing behind the trees. Ritimi and I remained on the sandy bank. She unwrapped the feathers and spread them on a stone for the sun to kill the lice. Excitedly, she pointed to a tree on the bank on which clusters of pale flowers hung like fruit. She cut whole branches, then offered me the flowers to eat. "They are sweet," she pointed out, upon noticing my reluctance to eat them. Trying to explain that the flowers reminded me of strongly perfumed soap, I fell asleep. I awoke with the sounds of dusk sweeping up the light of the day. The rustling of the breeze cooling the trees, the calls of birds settling for the night. Itua had returned with 2 carassos and a bundle of palm fronds. I helped Ritimi collect firewood along the river bank. While she plucked the birds, I assisted Itua with building the shelter. "Are you sure it's going to rain?" I asked him, looking at the clear, cloudless sky. "If old Kamosiwe said it's going to rain, then it will," Itua said. He can smell rain the way others can smell food. It was a cozy little hut. The front pole was higher than the two in the back, but not high enough for us to stand up. The poles were connected with long sticks, giving the shelter a triangular shape. Both the roof and the back were covered with palm fronds. We covered the ground with platanilo leaves, for the poles were not strong enough to support 3 hammocks. Actually, Itua did not build the shelter so much for Ritimi's and my comfort as for his. If he got wet in the rain, he might cause the child in Tutimi's womb to be born dead or deformed. Ritimi cooked the birds, several plantains, and the cacao seeds over the fire Itua built inside the hut. I mashed one of our pineapples. The mixture of flavors, textures, reminded me of a Thanksgiving dinner. It must be like momo nuts, Ritimi said after I had explained about cranberry sauce. Momo is also red. It needs to be boiled for a long time until it's soft. It also has to soak in water until all the poison is leached out. I don't think I'd like momo nuts. You will, Ritimi assured me. See how much you like the pohoro seeds? Momo nuts are even better. Smiling, I nodded. Although the roasted cacao seeds did not taste like chocolate, they were as delicious as fresh cashews. Itua and Ritimi were asleep the moment they lay back on the platanilo leaves. I stretched out next to Ritimi. In her sleep, she reached over, hugging me close to her. The warmth of her body filled me with a soothing laziness. Her rhythmic breathing lulled me into a pleasant drowsiness. A succession of dreamlike images drifted through my mind, sometimes slow, sometimes fast, as if someone were projecting them in front of me. Mokototeri men, brachiating from tree to tree, glided past me. Their cries indistinguishable from the howler monkeys. Crocodiles with luminous eyes, barely above the surface of the water, blinked sleepily, then suddenly opened their giant jaws, ready to swallow me. Ant-eaters were with thread-like vicious tongues, blew bubbles in which I saw myself captive together with hundreds of ants. I was awakened by a sudden gust of wind. It brought with it the smell of rain. I sat up and listened to the heavy drops pattering on the palm fronds. The familiar sounds of crickets and frogs provided a continuous, pulsating background hum to the plaintive cries of nocturnal monkeys, the flute-like calls of forest partridges. I was sure I heard steps, then the snapping of twigs. "There is someone out there," I said, reaching over to Itua. He moved to the front pole of the shelter. "It's a jaguar looking for frogs in the marshes." Itua turned my head slightly to the left. "You can smell him." I sniffed the air repeatedly. I can't smell a thing. It's the jaguar's breath that smells. It's strong because he eats everything raw. Itua turned my head once more, this time to the right. "Listen, he is returning to the forest." I lay down again. Ritimi awoke, rubbed her eyes, and smiled. I dreamt that I walked up in the mountains and saw the waterfalls. We will go that way tomorrow, Itua said, unfastening the apina pouch from around his neck. He poured some of the powder in his palm, then with one deep breath, drew it into his nostrils. Are you going to chant to the hikoras now? I asked. I will beg the spirits of the forest to protect us, Itua said, then began to chant in a low voice. His song, carried on the night breeze, seemed to traverse the darkness. I was certain it reached the spirits dwelling in the four corners of the earth. The fire died down to a red glimmer. I no longer heard Itua's voice, but his lips were still moving as I fell into a dreamless sleep. I was awakened shortly by Ritimi's soft moans and touched her shoulder, thinking she was having a nightmare. Do you want to try it? She murmured. Surprised, I opened my eyes and looked into Itua's smiling face. He was making love to her. I watched them for a while. The motion of their bodies was so closely adjusted, they barely moved. Itua, not in the least embarrassed, moved out of Ritimi and knelt in front of me. Lifting my legs, he stretched them slightly. He pressed his cheeks against my calves. His touch was like the playful caress of a child. There was no embrace. There were no words. Yet I was filled with tenderness. Itua switched to Ritimi again, resting his head between her shoulder and mine. Now we truly are sisters, Ritimi said softly. On the outside, we don't look the same, but our insides are the same now. I snuggled against her. The river breeze brushing through the shelter was like a caress. The rosy light of dawn descended gently over the treetops. Ritimi and Itua headed toward the river. I stepped outside the shelter and breathed in the new day. At dawn, the darkness of the forest is no longer black, but a bluish green, like an underground cave that is illuminated by a light filtering through some secret crack. A sprinkling of dew, like soft rain, wet my face as I pushed leaves and vines out of my way. Little red spiders with hairy legs hastily respun their silvery webs. Itua found a honeycomb inside a hollow trunk. After squeezing the last drop in our mouths, he soaked the comb in a water-filled calabash, and later we drank the sweet water. We climbed overgrown paths bordering small cascades and stretches of river that swept by at dizzying speeds, causing a breeze that blew our hair and swayed the bamboo on the shore. This is the scene of my dream, Ritimi said, extending her arms as if to embrace the wide expanse of water hurtling down before us into a deep, wide pool. I edged my way onto the dark basalt rocks protruding around the falls. For a long time I stood beneath it, my hands raised to break the thunderous force of the water descending from heights already warmed by the sun. Come out, white girl, Itua shouted. The spirits of the rushing water will make you ill. Later in the afternoon, we made camp by a grove of wild banana trees. Amidst them, I discovered an avocado tree, pear-shaped but round, as big as a cantaloupe, and shone as if it were made out of wax. Itua lifted me so I could reach the first branch. Then slowly I climbed toward the fruit, hanging at the tip of the highest limb. My greed to reach the green ball was so great, I ignored the brittle branches cracking under my weight. As I pulled the fruit toward me, the branch I was standing on gave way. Itua laughed till tears rolled down his cheeks. Ritimi, also laughing, scraped the mashed avocado from my stomach and thigh. I could have hurt myself, I said, piqued by their indifference and mirth. Maybe I broke a leg. No, you didn't, Itua assured me. The ground is soft with dead leaves. He scooped some mashed fruit in his hand and urged me to taste it. I told you not to stay under the falls, he added seriously. The spirits of the rushing water made you ignore the danger of dry branches. By the time Itua had built the shelter, all trace of day had vanished. The forest was clouded in a whitish mist. It did not rain, but the dew on the leaves fell in heavy drops at the slightest touch. We slept on the platanillo leaves, warmed by each other's bodies and by the low fire that Itua kept alive throughout the night, by periodically pushing the burning logs closer to the flame with his foot. We left our camp before dawn. Thick mist still shrouded the trees, and the cry of frogs reached us as if from a great distance. The higher we climbed, the scantier the vegetation became, until at last there was nothing but grasses and rocks. We reached the top of a plateau, eroded by winds and rains, a relic from another age. Below, the forest was still asleep under a blanket of fog. A mysterious, pathless world whose vastness one could never guess from the outside. We sat on the ground and silently waited for the sun to rise. An overwhelming sense of awe brought me to my feet as the sky in the east glowed red and purple along the horizon. The clouds, obedient to the wind, opened to let the rising disk through. Pink mist rolled over the treetops, touching up shadows with deep blue, spreading green and yellow all over the sky until it changed into a transparent blue. I turned to look behind me, to the west, where clouds were changing shape, giving way to the expanding light. To the south, the sky was tinted with fiery streaks and luminous clouds piled up, pushed by the wind. Over there is our Shabono, Itua said, pointing into the distance. He grasped my arm and turned me around into a northerly direction. And over there is the great river, where the white man passes by. The sun had lifted the blanket of fog. The river shone like a golden snake, cutting through the greenness until it lost itself in an immensity of space that seemed to be part of another world. I wanted to speak, to cry out loud, but I had no words with which to express my emotions. Looking at Ritimi and Itua, I knew they understood how deeply I felt. I held out my arms as if to embrace this marvelous border of forest and sky. I felt I was at the edge of time and space. I could hear the vibrations of the light, the whispering of trees, the cries of distant birds carried by the wind. I suddenly knew that it was out of choice and not out of lack of interest that the Itikoteri had never been curious about my past. For them, I had no personal history. Only thus could they have accepted me as something other than an oddity. Events and relationships of my past had begun to blur in my memory. It was not that I had forgotten them. I had simply stopped thinking about them, for they had no meaning there in the forest. Like the Itikoteri, I had learned to live in the present. Time was outside of me. It was something to be used only at the moment. Once used, it sank back into itself and became an imperceptible part of my inner being. You have been so quiet for so long, Ritimi said, sitting on the ground. Pulling her knees up, she clasped them, then rested her chin on them and gazed at me. I've been thinking of how happy I am to be here, I said. Smiling, Ritimi rocked herself gently to and fro. One day I will collect wood, and you will no longer be at my side. But I will not be sad, because this afternoon, before we reach the Shabono, we will paint ourselves with Onoto, and we will be happy watching a flow of macaws chase the setting sun.